So Clement Greenberg is going to make an argument that whatever the kind of pinnacle of art making is, however we understand it, it's got to be a new standard. It has to be reconfigured. So let's try to dig through his article and see what he's saying. And so we first want to try to identify what is his diagnosis. What does he think is the problem? Why doesn't the old Laocoon work, the old standards work? What problem needs to be addressed? So if you have your essay, you can take it out and refer to it. If you don't have it, that's fine. I'll try to put the quotes up on the screen. But you might, from now on, bring those with you, bring your course pack with you, or at least the articles we're working on to class, because we'll refer to them and read from them and so on. And I want to start by trying to get his diagnosis at the beginning of this essay. I think he lays it out. And he says this, starting from the very beginning here. And by the way, these are clipped down. I'm thinking about you guys. These are clipped down so that they're a little bit more manageable in length, because they're pretty dense. This is pretty dense reading, right? So I tried to clip it down so that you can concentrate on the few pages that we're going to talk about rather than the whole thing. That does mean, however, that if you're interested in this, go back and read it, the whole thing at some point, and that may change your opinion. But I'm trying to give you only what we'll talk about in class so we can maintain focus. Okay, so starting from the beginning, he says this: there can be, I believe, such a thing as a dominant art form. Dominant art form. This was what literature had become in Europe by the 17th century. Now, when it happens that a single art is given the dominant role, it becomes the prototype of all art. The others try to shed their proper characteristics and imitate its effects. The dominant art, in turn, tries itself to absorb the functions of the others. So what happens when an art form is dominant? If literature, for instance, becomes the dominant art form, then what that means is that the other art forms, like painting, for instance, tries to shed the characteristics that are unique to it and tries to absorb the characteristics of literature. So painting, for instance, that does what literature does or operates analogous to literature. Yeah. Is it just narrative only belongs to literature, or can that belong to painting in its own way? And if it does belong in its own way, how is the way painting does narrative different and fully distinct from how literature does narrative? Let's suspend that question for just a moment. I'll show you some examples and we'll try to get more of what he says, but I think that's a really good question to ask at this point. Is narrative and literary subjects dominance, the subjugation, painting subjugation to literature? Is that what he means? Or is it more complicated than that? So we'll go on. The dominant art, in turn, tries to absorb the functions of the others, and a confusion of the arts results, by which the subservient ones are perverted and distorted. They are forced to deny their own nature in an effort to attain the effects of the dominant art. However, the subservient arts can only be mishandled in this way when they have reached such a degree of technical facility as to enable them to pretend to conceal their mediums. In other words, the artist must have gained such power over his material as to annihilate it, seemingly in favor of illusion. So just to make sure we're tracking with him, what is his diagnosis? In his words, if one art form is given a dominant role over the other art forms, then what results is a confusion. And I think what he's after is trying to correct confusions. The confusion. That's sort of what drives him. We'll see later on next week, he's very interested in Kant, Immanuel Kant, who's trying to make the disciplines of reason and aesthetic judgment and so on self-sufficient, totally self-sufficient, so they're not being confused and all wrapped up and muddled in other disciplines. So he's trying to correct a confusion by distinguishing what's specific and unique about each of the art forms. And as long as one art form is dominating the others, the confusion persists. And what does the confusion look like? It looks like the subservient ones, like painting or sculpture, being perverted and distorted so that they are forced to deny their own nature in an effort to attain the effects of the dominant art, literature. They behave like literature, and they can only behave like literature when they cease to cloak and withhold the way that they really are in themselves. And as he says, how does this happen? How do they cloak themselves? It is by concealing the medium itself. The medium itself. So what's the medium of painting? Paint and wood and canvas, something flat, an object that hangs in a room, the stuff that the thing is made of. The mediums of, or media of sculpture would be the stone, the wood, the plaster, whatever it's made out of. And as long as those are concealing themselves in order to represent something else or behave in a literary way, then they're always wrapped up in this kind of illusion where they are presenting something other than themselves. Okay, does that make sense as his diagnosis? What he sees as a confusion, something wrong, something off. And what are his examples? He doesn't name names so much, but we could certainly find examples all over the place, right? When you look at this, what do you see? What is this? The death of Socrates? Greenberg would say, you're already confused. This is not the death of Socrates. This is paint on canvas. And precisely what it's doing is concealing itself or being arranged in such a way that what you think about and pay attention to, the way you're impacted by this painting, is not the paint itself, the medium itself. Rather, you're launched almost immediately into thinking about Socrates and his voluntary suicide execution, right? I would rather die and hold true to the good, the true, and the beautiful than to renounce it. So I'll take the hemlock. And Greenberg is saying that whole discussion is subservient. It's painting acting as a handmaiden to literature, right? I mean, very directly in this case. It's painting serving Socrates. It's literature very directly. It's written form as being more important and more dominant than the painting itself, the visual effect of the thing itself, the forms themselves. It's so hard to see these forms without seeing flesh and seeing fabric, seeing stone. And as he goes on to say, on the opposite side of the page over here, right-hand column, about halfway down, total subservience to literature occurs when all emphasis is taken away from the medium and transferred to the subject matter. And that's what's happening in that Death of Socrates painting. What is medium? That's the paint, the canvas, that sort of stuff. What is subject matter? What it depicts, what the painting is of. Socrates, for instance. So when the emphasis is taken away from the medium and transferred to the subject matter, I think that's what he would say is subservience to literature. And that kind of gets back to Amy's question. I think Greenberg would say that narrative of any kind, and I think he might even go so far as to say representation, subject matter at all, is subservience to literature. I don't know if that's fair. Simply because I don't know that, I mean, so what is literature? I mean, what isn't literature, I mean, I think we would be fairly disappointed if we were to read a book and only draw our attention to the medium and not the subject matter. I mean, I think what he's calling for in painting is analogous to a book that doesn't say anything. It's just forms on paper, right? So maybe in his scheme, literature is subservient to something else. So it's not necessarily that painting is subservient to literature, it's that all of them are behaving as media. I mean, he might have a point in an instance like this, where clearly the subject matter is derived from literature. Okay, so what does Greenberg then articulate as being the response? What's the response to this? If this is the problem, subservience that results in confusion about the arts, then what's the response? You'll see that at the bottom of the second column, and we'll read some of that. He says this: as the first and most important item upon its agenda, the avant-garde. He introduces the term avant-garde here. As the first and most important item on its agenda, the avant-garde saw the necessity of an escape from ideas which were infecting the arts with the ideological struggles of society. Ideas came to mean subject matter in general, subject matter as distinguished from content. Oh, that's going to be important. We'll sort that out here in a bit. Ideas came to mean subject matter in general. In parentheses, subject matter is distinguished from content in the sense that every work of art must have content. It must be meaningful. But that subject matter is something the artist does or does not have in mind when he is actually at work. This meant a new and greater emphasis upon form, and it also involved the assertion of the arts as independent vocations, disciplines, and crafts, absolutely autonomous and entitled to respect for their own sakes, and not merely as vessels of communication. It was the signal for a revolt against the dominance of literature, which was subject matter at its most oppressive. That's kind of dense, isn't it? Did you get any of that? We'll sort through it, what he just said, because it's important to understanding his take on what the modern is. First, it's important to point out that his response, what he sees as the response to this confusion, is the avant-garde. Have you heard that term before? In modernity, I imagine you covered that term. What does the avant-garde mean? What does the word mean? What does the term mean? Avant is forward, and garde is guard. So what does it mean? It's a French term that means the advance guard or the forward guard. It's a military term, right? There's in kind of military movements, the rear guard are the people who are in the back, making sure you don't get ambushed from the back, sort of following up, protecting the kind of main group from behind. So what is the avant-garde then, or the forward guard? Those who are out in front of everything. They see what's coming. They see the dangers, they see the landscape, they see the terrain, they see what's coming before anyone else. It's kind of self-congratulating term, really, to title yourself the avant-garde, but basically it is what the avant-garde do is they are the artists who are out in front and they see what has to happen and they see how things have to change and how the whole community, the whole army, the battalion needs to change direction to avoid further error or what have you. So who are the avant-garde in 20th century art criticism and in Greenberg's use of the term? It's those artists who are out in front, who are working towards the newer Laocoon. They're going to articulate and identify what the new standards are going to be and what the new way of meaning in art is going to be. And he gives us some very specific jobs for the avant-garde to do. And at this point in 1940, he's partially, I think, prescribing what artists need to do, but he's also identifying what they have been doing. What has the avant-garde been doing? And he gives us a couple things in that passage we just read. First, they need to remove subject matter from art by distinguishing it from content, right? He says in that passage that I read, ideas were infecting the arts. Infecting. But ideas, what I mean by ideas came to mean subject matter. But that's not the same as content, is what he wants to say. What is subject matter? We've already defined it. It's what a painting is about, or what an artwork is about. The sculpture that we were looking at has the subject matter of Laocoon, right? But what is content? What does that mean? What's depicted? Yeah, depicted is gonna fall back into subject matter. What's depicted? What it's about? What it images? The scene? That would all kind of funnel back into subject matter. I think what he is meaning here with content, and usually what it means in this kind of art discussions, is that the content, when it's distinguished from subject matter, is the meaning, the meaningfulness of the thing. And that, you're right to say form and what it contains more broadly, because that's where he's going to put the meaning. But when he distinguishes subject matter from content, he's distinguishing what is pictured from what it means, how it means. So what he's going to say is, to get back to an earlier point, what he's going to say, what he wants to do, is to say that if we remove subject matter from painting, we haven't removed meaning. We haven't removed content. When we remove ideas from painting, which he's going to say, what he means by ideas, he says, ideas become attached to subject matter. So ideas are what you're trying to depict. I've got this agenda that I want to communicate, and that's what the idea is, or the subject matter is. But he's going to say that's not what it ends up meaning. The meaning is bigger than that. Meaning isn't necessarily tied to what you want the work to be about or what you're depicting. After all, there are a million ways to depict the Madonna and Child, same subject matter, and have them come out meaning totally different things, totally opposite things. You can depict the Madonna and Child, same subject matter, in total blackness and in total gold, and those are going to mean something incredibly different. And that the difference in the meaning is in the form of the thing, not in the subject matter. So this, our earlier conversation about if you drain the thing of subject matter, does it become meaningless? Greenberg says no. It's still meaningful, we just have to let it mean in a different way. And we have to do that at the beginning by distinguishing what it shows from what it means.